They say that timing is everything, and that seems to be true for so many things. Certainly in the stock market, that's absolutely true. There's really no such thing as a good stock or a bad stock, only a good time or a bad time to buy or sell a stock. For example, Tesla stock has been a great investment over the long term, with an average rate of return of about 40% over the last 10 years. A $10,000 investment in 2015 is now worth about $290,000 today. However, if you had bought Tesla on the day of Trump's inauguration in January of 25, you would have paid $421 a share. As you watched it go down after he took office, if you had panicked and sold it just in March of that same year, you would have lost 43%. So, was it a bad stock, or was it a bad time to sell? Conversely, if you had bought it in March of last year and held on to it till today, you would now be about 88% richer. See, it's not the stock, it's the timing. Timing matters in so many other ways too, and that includes the scriptures and revelation. How, you say? Well, let's talk about that today. If the Book of Mormon were published today, it would perhaps not be so impressive or important as it is. In the almost 200 years since 1830, so many scientific and archaeological discoveries have been made, and so many documents have been found that support the claims of this great book, that the Book of Mormon would be much less impactful if published for the first time today. We have discovered the Amarna text and the Nag Hammadi Codex and the Lachish letters, and, perhaps most impressively, the Dead Sea Scrolls. All of these documents lend serious supporting evidence to the claims of the Book of Mormon. But they do so only because the Book of Mormon was published first, before any of them were discovered. For that matter, the 1830 publication date of the book was 25 years before the translation of the Rosetta Stone, which gave the world its first chance to interpret and decipher the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs and written language, which in fact opened up the ancient civilization to the whole world. Nevertheless, without any of those discoveries at the time, the Book of Mormon gave us a glimpse into ancient Egypt and much of its culture. Joseph Smith presented to the world a book without precedent. Had the book come out now instead of 1830, it would have been just as true, but critics could have rightly claimed that he simply cobbled together a story based on all the recent discoveries that scientists and archaeologists have made. This would be particularly true of all the research that has been and is still going on in Central America. The ancient ruins and pyramids and temples of central Mexico, none of which were understood in Joseph's day, are today powerful testimonies of the technology and cultural associations of the very early Central Americans to the Egyptian and Middle Eastern cultures of those days. So in a very real sense, it can be said that one of the marvels of the Book of Mormon is that it said things first, before any of these discoveries were made, and therefore Joseph Smith could not have borrowed or plagiarized or co-opted any of the subsequent research. He said it first, and there's power in that. The timing is the key. That's why I want to talk about timing today. and I'm not really sure where to start. There's just so much. How about the visit of Jesus Christ to the Americas? The Book of Mormon is called another testament of Jesus Christ. Why? Because probably its most powerful claim is that Jesus Christ came and walked in the Americas. He made a heavenly visit to the people of the Book of Mormon shortly after his resurrection in Jerusalem, and that account takes up most of the book of 3rd Nephi. It's a remarkable story, a story which critics and scholars laughed at in the 1800s, but which today doesn't seem so far-fetched at all. Archaeologists have uncovered great amounts of evidence of a white-bearded God who appeared to the people of Central and South America long ago. Listen to this description that I found during my research. Researchers, historians, and comparative religion scholars have long noted Mesoamerican and Andean traditions describing a white-robed, often bearded, divine or semi-divine visitor who taught laws, morality, and civilization, and then departed with a promise to return. He's known by several different names. The Aztecs and Toltecs called him Quetzalcoatl. The temples and pyramids all through Central America are covered with representations of him. The name actually means feathered serpent, but that's not as bad as it sounds. It should be noted that rather than representing evil, as in later European Christianity, the serpent here in the Americas represented life, power, wisdom, fertility, and the connection between the worlds. It was a very positive representation of a divine being. Kukulkan is the Mayan name for the same god, who is associated with wisdom, calendar knowledge, and moral reforms. This god is linked to the temples of Chichen Itza in the Yucatan, where the serpent shadow appears on the equinoxes. In Colombia, they have Bochica, described as an elder teacher figure, light-skinned and bearded, who gave moral laws and religious instruction. And then in the Mayan Chiapas region of Mexico, which, by the way, I believe is exactly where Zarahemla was located, we have Votan, a, quote, culture bringer and civilizer, associated with writing, law, and religion. And he's often associated with Eastern origins. Farther south, the Incas had Viracocha, again appearing as a white bearded man who taught civilization, laws, and arts. Some notes that I found say, quote, Spanish chroniclers were struck by how closely descriptions resembled Christian imagery, close quote. During the early 1500s, the Spanish conquistadors, led by Hernán Cortés, came to Central America. They were met by very little resistance from Montezuma and the Aztecs because he thought Cortés might be the returning white-bearded god Quetzalcoatl, whom they had been looking for and who was promised to return one day. And as you may know, that was disastrous for the Aztecs. While scholars today have this knowledge readily available, most of it was unknown or at very least unavailable to Joseph Smith in his day. So his claim, or should I say the claim of the Book of Mormon, that Jesus Christ visited the Americas is not nearly so outrageous now as it seemed in 1830. Again, timing is everything. Had Joseph Smith presented the Book of Mormon after all this knowledge was widely known, it would have been easy for scholars to say, of course, he borrowed the legends and put Christ in the middle of them. Another interesting point is the Book of Ether. It details the journey and voyage of a group of people called the Jaredites. They left Mesopotamia about 2,000 years before Christ, about the time of the Tower of Babel. The record claims that they crossed what is today China and settled on the eastern shore of that land, bordering the ocean. They stayed there for several years while they built a number of barges, and once completed, they set out in those same barges to cross the Pacific Ocean, and they landed in what is today western Mexico. The Book of Mormon claims in Ether 6 verses 10 through 11 the following: "And thus they were driven forth, and no monster of the sea could break them, neither whale that could mar them. And they did have light continually, whether it was above the water or under the water. And thus they were driven forth 344 days upon the water." Now that's a very specific detail to put in the record. 344 days. Why would Joseph Smith say that? He had no reason to be that specific. He didn't say that when talking about the Nephites and their journey across the ocean. There, the record simply said, "And it came to pass that I, Nephi, did guide the ship, that we sailed again towards the promised land. And it came to pass that after many days we did arrive at the promised land. And we went forth upon the land, and did pitch our tents, and we did call it the promised land." See, it just says many days. That's how the Nephite voyage is described. Joseph Smith does not tell us how many days exactly that was, but for the Jaredites, it was 344 days exactly. Why do I bring this up? Because two things must be remembered here. One is that the Nephites were in a sailing vessel. They could navigate and use the wind. We know they did navigate because they tell us that the Liahona guided them. When the brothers tied Nephi to the mast in an attempt to kill him, 1 Nephi 18 says, "And it came to pass that after they had bound me, insomuch that I could not move, the compass which had been prepared of the Lord did cease to work." And then in verse 21 it says, "And it came to pass that after they loosed me, behold, I took the compass, and it did work whither I desired it. And it came to pass that I prayed unto the Lord, and after I prayed, the winds did cease, and the storm did cease, and there was great calm." But the Jaredites were in barges. They did not have sails and were totally at the mercy of the currents and a little bit of the winds. And isn't it lucky that there were currents that would take them across the sea at all? They could have just floated around forever, landing who knows where. So we have two different voyages of two different groups of people and two different manners of conducting those voyages. The Jaredites were at the mercy of the currents, and Joseph had no knowledge of ocean currents. No one in his day even knew if the currents would travel all the way from China to the Americas. But now we do, so let's take a look. Today, with our satellite technology and other sensing devices we have invented, we now have a very good picture of the currents that roll around the world's oceans. And here's some of what we've learned. From southeastern China to Central America, there are three primary currents that span that distance. The first is the Kuroshio current, which comes into southeastern China right around Taiwan and the Fujian province. That current travels up the coast of China and past Japan, where it merges or changes into the North Pacific current, which carries the water west to east from about the Chukchi Peninsula to about Sitka, Alaska, where it meets the California current, which carries the water right down to central Mexico, right around the Tuxtla Tehuantepec area. And right there, it makes a sharp turn back across the ocean to China once more. Joseph didn't know any of this, and yet his translation shows us that they could only have used the currents to travel from China to Mexico. But what about those currents? How fast do they travel? And could they actually have carried Jaredite barges all the way? Well, the short answer is yes. The long answer involves measuring the speed of each current and the distance each would have carried the vessels. And if you do the research and do the math, it turns out that on average, a low-profile vessel set adrift in southeastern China would have taken approximately 347 days to reach Central America. And as evidence of this, the terrible earthquake that struck Japan in March of 2011 caused widespread damage and destruction, among which several boats were cast adrift and lost. Well, they started showing up along the west coast of the United States starting 1 year afterwards. The large fishing boat Ryu Un Maru showed up a year later off the coast of British Columbia. Others took a little longer, but being driven by winds and such, they easily could have taken longer. The Jaredites were very low in the water, sometimes even being submerged occasionally, and much more at the mercy of the currents than of the winds or anything else. The point is, the voyage described by the Book of Ether was not only plausible, but highly possible, and in fact recreated to a degree in more recent events. So, if the Book of Ether were written today, the voyage of the Jaredites would not be so remarkable, at least according to our modern knowledge of ocean currents. Again, timing is everything. Joseph told us first, and before any of this knowledge was available. The Book of Mormon led the way on this account. The description of the destruction that befell the Book of Mormon people at the death of the Savior is remarkably full and complete. We have tempests, storms, lightnings, quakings, cities being sunk, and cities being buried. We have darkness and a pretty vivid description of just how dark, and the consequences of that darkness. So, what are we to make of this? Is it just a richly detailed story, or is it a pretty accurate account by someone who lived through it of the horrible events that struck Central America at the time of the Savior's crucifixion? To hear from someone who had firsthand experience with this stuff and who was a leading researcher in volcanology, let me tell you about Dr. Jeffrey Curran Wynn, Chief Scientist, Volcano Hazards, U.S. Geological Survey. He was at one time responsible for 72 scientists at the Cascade Volcano Observatory in Washington State. And by the way, this information comes from and can be found in the book Joseph Smith and the Geography of the Book of Mormon by John L. Lund. He says this: Dr. Wynn accepted the challenge to read and comment on the events of the American continent recorded in 3 Nephi 8 in the Book of Mormon. This chapter regards the great destructions at the time of the death of Christ. After a long and serious analysis of 3 Nephi 8, Dr. Wynn concluded that the events described followed the exact pattern of volcanic eruptions. The pattern is followed in every detail in 3 Nephi 8. The account given in 3 Nephi 8 is a scientific report. All 72 volcanologists at this USGS Volcano Observatory would agree the sequence of events is extremely accurate. Furthermore, Dr. Wynn claimed that Guatemala and Central America were the only reasonable candidates for the events in 3 Nephi 8. I found this report by 2 Mexican archaeologists, a lady named Patricia Plunkett and another named Gabriela Urunduela. They described a significant eruption in Central America during the spring of the early 1st century AD. According to bookofmormoncentral.com, these 2 archaeologists documented the eruption of the Popocatépetl volcano. During that event, the site of Titempe was covered under a massive layer of volcanic ash. The cataclysm created a column of tephra, which is volcanic ash, 20 to 30 kilometers high, and is believed to have caused an ecological disaster of unprecedented proportions. Plunkett and Urunduela argued that this massive eruption was the leading cause of significant demographic changes in the basin of Mexico, resulting in the abandonment of most settlements in the southern region of the valley. Between 80 and 90% of the population became concentrated up around Mexico City near the site of Teotihuacan. And they estimate that as many as 20,000 people in the basin of Mexico may have perished in the disaster, while as many as 50,000 relocated north to the city. The account continues. The fires, smoke, lava flows, and other phenomena during the eruption had a similar calamitous effect on the eastern side of the mountains, where the population was reduced by as much as 30%. The archaeologists characterized this Popocatépetl eruption as one of the largest human catastrophes of the prehistoric period. There's much more detail to all of this in the book I mentioned. As with many other examples in the Book of Mormon, this account in 3rd Nephi gives far more detail than would be expected if the book were fraudulent. Remember, it is details that get false accounts exposed. And once again, none of this information was known in 1830. So the Book of Mormon led the way on this as well. Now, the largest book in the Book of Mormon is the Book of Alma. For many years, this book was derided by critics because of the name. They claimed that Alma was a girl's name and that there was absolutely no evidence of it ever being used in ancient days as a male name among the Semitic people, or any people for that matter. And yet we have Alma the Elder, once a priest for the wicked King Noah, who was converted by Abinadi, and then his son, whom we call Alma the Younger, who fills most of the Book of Alma. These two men figure prominently in Mormon's abridgment. So for 130 years, we had to live with this critical denial of the authenticity of this element of the book. And then along came 1960 and the discovery of a cache of letters attributed to one Simon Bar Kokhba. They were discovered in a cave in Nahal Hever and date to about 132 to 135 AD. They include military orders, administrative correspondence, and personal documents, and deal primarily with the revolt against Rome. According to Stephen Ricks, although the female personal name Alma is popular in the Western tradition of naming, the male personal name Alma is of incontestable antiquity. The name appears at least 8 times in documents dating from the late 3rd millennium BC and from the archives of Ebla, located in modern-day Syria. It also occurs in the Bar Kokhba letters, dating from the period of the Second Jewish Revolt in 132 to 135 AD. It appears as Alma ben Yehuda, which means Alma, son of Judah, in a business document. These latter archives were discovered in 1975 at a site called Ebla, anciently but today known as Tel Mardich in Syria. One particular interest to me has always been the Isaiah scriptures in the Book of Mormon. As many of you may know, I wrote a book called Compare Isaiah, Understanding Biblical Scriptures in the Book of Mormon. It is still available from Amazon or through Cedar Fort Publishing. Anyway, I did in that book what the Book of Mormon told me to do. I compared the two sets of scripture side by side, and what I found was truly amazing. There were, in fact, numerous differences, and in almost every case, the Book of Mormon verses were much clearer and more logical than the biblical verses. Now, before I give you some examples, let me speak for a moment of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Scroll number 1 from Cave 1 at Qumran contains the full manuscript of Isaiah. There were also many other scroll fragments and other scrolls in that and other caves that contained large portions of Isaiah. It seems Isaiah was of great importance to the people of Qumran, and originally it was claimed that the Cave 1 scroll followed the biblical Isaiah word for word. Now, this would have been a blow to the Nephi versions, to be sure, but more recent admissions from the translators reveal that, in fact, the Qumran text actually contains, quote, thousands of differences, close quote, although most are minor and do not change the meaning, according to the scholars. In fact, there are between 2,600 and 3,000 textual differences, although many are in fact just spelling or word order. But the researchers admit that there are almost 200 differences that do affect translation. And remember, changes that a scholar who does not have the understanding of the fullness of the gospel may discount may in fact be significant. Let me give you an example. Longtime listeners may recall that I did a full episode on this way back at the beginning in episode number 4. It was called The Difference One Word Makes. First, I'll give you an example of that one word difference, and then I will show how word order, something the scholars thought unimportant, can greatly affect the meaning of the message. In Isaiah chapter 2, verse 2, we read, "And it shall come to pass in the last days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established in the tops of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow unto it." That's a nice verse, and it makes a clear statement. And it says that temples will be established in the tops of the mountains. And it has long been interpreted by LDS members as referring to the temples in Utah, which are in fact in the middle of the mountains. But that is not how it was written in the English Book of Mormon. And I say the English Book of Mormon because this change was so subtle that the Spanish Book of Mormon translators missed it completely, and I suspect other translations as well. But here's the deal. In 2 Nephi chapter 12, verse 2, which is the comparable verse in the Book of Mormon, it says this in the first line. "And it shall come to pass in the last days, when the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established in the tops of the mountains." And to be clear, in the Bible it says that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established, and in the Book of Mormon it says when the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established. Now this may not seem so important, but in fact it completely changes the message. In Isaiah in the Bible, as you begin to read, it seems as if chapter 2 is a whole new statement, a whole new thought, that Isaiah has moved on from his condemnation of Israel as found in chapter 1, and is now talking about latter-day temples. But if you read chapter 1 carefully, you will see that Isaiah, after he condemns Israel, makes promises that all will be restored one day. Now, 2 Nephi does not include Isaiah 1, so we just start with Isaiah 2. But in the Bible, the promise of restoration for Israel is left hanging at the end of chapter 1. When will it happen? And how? And why? Well, Nephi got it right. His version says it, meaning the restoration, will happen when the mountain of the Lord's house is established in the tops of the mountains. In other words, when there are temples once again upon the earth and the priesthood ordinances of salvation are available to the people. That's when the restorations of the blessings to Israel will be had. You see, chapter 2 of Isaiah is not a new thought. Rather, it is a continuation of chapter 1. And in fact, it's my opinion that it should be part of chapter 1. But here's the amazing thing. This was translated by Joseph Smith in the spring of 1829, before the church was organized and before he even knew about temples or temple ordinances. And I believe it may have even been translated before he and Oliver received the priesthood. So why would he make that change? That's the only change in that whole verse. Why did he change one word from something that sounded good as it stood and make it sound just a little bit more confusing? Well, if you turn to your Bible and go to Isaiah 2, verse 2, you will see that the word "that" is italicized. That means that the King James translators inserted that word in place of another word that perhaps was more confusing to them, or for which they thought that the word made more sense. Sometimes those italicized words were inserted where there was a missing text. And to understand more fully why this happened, you need to know that the William Tyndale Bible, which was the first full translation of both the Old and New Testaments, found disfavor with Queen Elizabeth. She wanted a better version, one that more closely agreed with the Church of England theology. Now, she never did anything about that, but her successor, King James I, did. He assembled, ultimately, 47 translators to go over William Tyndale's Bible and correct it as necessary. They left about 95% of it alone, but there was 5% that they did tweak. King James's demand to them was that they made sure it conformed to the ecclesiology of the Church of England. So the translators were under the gun. They knew that William Tyndale had been imprisoned and executed for his work, and they certainly did not want to follow him. But back to Joseph Smith's translation. His change to the word when established that the blessings of Israel were directly tied to the future temples, something which, as I said before, Joseph Smith did not understand as he translated this. And yet again, he was ahead, not only of world knowledge, but also of his own knowledge. To me, this stands as a powerful testimony of his divine calling and to the authenticity of the Book of Mormon. Now, as I said, the Dead Sea Scrolls admit that a number of changes did affect the translations. And we discussed briefly word order. Let me show you one of those examples from Joseph's translation of 2 Nephi. We find this in 2 Nephi 7, verse 1, and it is cognate with Isaiah 50, verse 1. And it shows how the order of words, which the scholars deemed insignificant, can greatly affect the meaning and the message of the passage. In Isaiah it says this, "Thus saith the Lord, where is the bill of your mother's divorcement, whom I have put away? Or which of my creditors is it to whom I have sold you?" Now, when it says, "whom I have put away," it clearly sounds like the Lord did indeed put her away. However, in 2 Nephi, we see a completely different order and an opposite declaration by the Lord. There we read, "Yea, for thus saith the Lord, have I put thee away, or have I cast thee off forever?" See, right off the bat, it is now a question rather than a statement. It's a challenge. He continues, "Where is the bill of your mother's divorcement? To whom have I put thee away? Or to which of my creditors have I sold you?" He's challenging those who would have accused him of such an action by saying, "Where's your proof? Show me a bill of divorcement, or tell me to whom I have sold you." As you can see, the order of the words and an addition of one or two can make a significant difference. And I think everyone would agree that the Book of Mormon verse is much clearer and more logical than the one in Isaiah chapter 50. And again, let me remind you, all of this was translated before there was a church and before the fullness of the gospel was on display. How audacious of young Joseph Smith to edit a venerated text such as Isaiah's. And yet, how appropriate, because obviously Isaiah's words are of paramount importance to the scriptural records, and apparently they were not perfectly translated in the Bible. And in 3 Nephi chapter 23, we read the Savior's own words when he told the Nephites, "And now behold, I say unto you, that ye ought to search these things. Yea, a commandment I give unto you, that ye search these things diligently. For great are the words of Isaiah." So it only makes sense that in the Book of Mormon, Joseph would have gotten the translation correct. Now, there are 337 names in the Book of Mormon. Of these, 149 also appear in the Bible, but there are fully 188 names that are new and unique to the Book of Mormon. It seems Joseph Smith led the way here also. Let's look at more recent archaeological discoveries in Egypt and see how they compare to some of these unique names that appear in the Book of Mormon. As the secrets of ancient Egypt were uncovered, it became apparent that the ancient Egyptians also displayed a significant variation in their names as well. As an example, let's look at Ammon, which appears to be the most common name in Egypt. Variations of that are Amon and Amun. It actually means great universal God of the empire, and men named Ammon were often servants of the temple of Ammon. Well, in the Book of Mormon, one of our most prominent characters is Ammon. Plus, we have numerous other names where Ammon is part of the name. Ammon or Ammon was often a suffix appended onto other Egyptian root names. An example is the great famous King Tut. His name was Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun is how we say it sometimes. In the Egyptian text, we find the name Heramon, Heramon. His name means in the presence of Ammon. And in the Book of Mormon, we find the name Helaman, Helamon. Now here's the interesting thing. The Semitic or Hebrew L is always replaced by an R in Egyptian. There is no L in Egyptian, but there is in Hebrew. So if written in Egyptian, the Book of Mormon name Helaman would be Heramon, just as it is. And that is exactly how we find it in Old World texts. Keep in mind that the Book of Mormon is about a people who are a blend of Egyptian and Hebrew cultures. So the Helaman that we read about in the Book of Mormon is most likely their version of Heramon. Well, interestingly, in ancient Egypt, we have a character who, when he became a king, changed his name to Meri-Ammon. In the Book of Mormon, we have the name Morianton with Anton instead of Ammon. Morianton was the founder and leader of the people we find in Alma chapter 50. Let me tell you just a little bit more about Meri-Ammon. He was the king of the people in Egypt, but he had changed his name from Pa-Nazem when he became the king. Now, the interesting thing here is that as Pa-Nazem, he had been a chief judge. He was one of a number of people we have records for who were judges in Egypt. Another was a man named Pa-Yank. Also, we have a Pa-Manech, and we have a Pa-Manke. All of these start with the prefix PA, and all of them were judges in Egypt. In the Book of Mormon, turning to the Book of Helaman, chapter 1, we read about one Pa-Anki. Pa-Anki was a chief judge in the land of the Nephites, and he was followed by Pa-Kumenai, who was followed by Pahoran, who was followed by another Pahoran, who was the fourth Nephite judge. These men were all chief judges, and all had names that started with PA, following the Egyptian tradition for the names of judges. Now let's talk about Pa-Yank, another of the Egyptian judges, for just a minute. The great LDS scriptorian Hugh Nibley states the following. Pa-Yank was the son of Kerahor and chief high priest of Ammon. Nibley then goes on to state the name in the form Pa-Yanki is borne by two rulers of the south of Egypt, particularly near Thebes. They were the first and fourth kings of the 25th dynasty. It is absolutely identical with the Pa-Yanki of Helaman 1, verse 3. There's much more to the association between Book of Mormon and Egyptian names. For more of that, you can reference my episode number 11, The Extraordinary Book of Mormon Names. Joseph Smith presented to the world so many ideas, concepts, and truths that took the rest of the world years, decades, even more than a century to discover. One would have to admit that he was, at very least, a forward-looking visionary, but much more likely, he was exactly what he claimed to be, a prophet called of God to usher in a new dispensation. I have always maintained that the Book of Mormon is not the only book to say many of the things it says. It was simply the first. And I think this is important. To produce a book like the Book of Mormon after so many scientific and archaeological discoveries were made would have opened it up to the very legitimate charge of plagiarism or simply using already recognized facts and weaving a compelling story with them. But to say all these things in the face of steep criticism and mockery, and to the contradiction of many held beliefs at that time, and to endure that mockery for so many decades is another matter altogether. The Book of Mormon had to be the first to reveal this information, or it would have lost much of its credibility. The fact that it was translated in just 65 days, dictated by one man and written by another, is remarkable. Even more amazing is that during that time, never once did Joseph ask Oliver to read back anything that had been dictated. Never once was anything edited or rewritten. Emma Smith testified many years later that after meals or other breaks, Joseph would sit down and immediately begin where he left off, never going back or reviewing where they had stopped. She said this was a normal thing to do. He and his scribes, primarily Oliver, but also Martin Harris for a bit, and Emma as well, produced on average about 8 pages a day, every day. And during that time, the manuscript maintained continuity with previously written pages and with facts and with accounts. The later records often hearkened back to previous accounts and sometimes gave further details. One of my favorite examples of this is first alluded to in the Book of Omni, where Amaleki speaks of a group of men who left Zarahemla to return to the land of Nephi. Here's what he said. And now I would speak somewhat concerning a certain number who went up into the wilderness to return to the land of Nephi, for there was a large number who were desirous to possess the land of their inheritance. Wherefore they went up into the wilderness, and their leader being a strong and mighty man, and a stiff-necked man, wherefore he caused a contention among them, and they were all slain, save 50 in the wilderness, and they returned again to the land of Zarahemla. And it came to pass that they also took others to a considerable number, and took their journey again into the wilderness. And I, Amaleki, had a brother who also went with them, and I have not since known concerning them. And I'm about to lie down in my grave, and these plates are full, and I make an end of my speaking. Well, that's sad that Amaleki never did hear about his brother, but the whole account is tantalizing, and we'd like to know more of the story. But we don't get it there. Well, in the next book of the Book of Mormon, called the Book of Mosiah, we read about a man named Zeniff. He was not mentioned by name in Amaleki in Omni, but in the 9th chapter of Mosiah, we learn that he was one of the people referred to by Amaleki. It says, I, Zeniff, having been taught in all the language of the Nephites, and having had a knowledge of the land of Nephi, or the land of our fathers' first inheritance, and having been sent as a spy among the Lamanites that I might spy out their forces, that our army might come upon them and destroy them, but when I saw that which was good among them, I was desirous that they should not be destroyed. Therefore I contended with my brethren in the wilderness, for I would that our leader should make a treaty with them. But he, being a bloodthirsty man, commanded that I should be slain. But I was rescued by the shedding of much blood, for father fought against father, and brother against brother, until a greater number of the army was destroyed in the wilderness. And we returned, those of us that were spared, to the land of Zarahemla to relate the tale to their wives and their children. And yet, I, being overzealous to inherit the land of our fathers, collected as many as were desirous to go up to possess the land, and started again on our journey into the wilderness to go up to the land. But we were smitten with famine and sore afflictions, for we were slow to remember the Lord our God. So here we hear from one of the men that Amaleki referred to, and we hear why there was a contention that took the lives of many. But there was still so much more. In fact, Mosiah 9 through 22 is Zenoph's record of that whole adventure and journey and of his time in the land of Nephi with the Lamanites and in the land of Lehi Nephi. It's quite a story. And just a little aside here, while Nephi was dealing with the Lamanites, he hears their side of the story of their break with the Nephites so long ago. And in the course of that, we hear their account of the ocean voyage that Lehi and Sariah and Nephi and the boys took with the family of Ishmael. Obviously, their side of the story has a different slant, but I think the callback is interesting. This was their take on that history. They were a wild and a ferocious and bloodthirsty people, believing in the traditions of their father, which is, believing that they were driven out of the land of Jerusalem because of the iniquities of their fathers, and that they were wronged in the wilderness by their brethren, and they were also wronged while crossing the sea. And again, they were wronged while in the land of their first inheritance after they had crossed the sea, and all this because that Nephi was more faithful in keeping the commandments of the Lord. And his brethren were wroth with him because they understood not the dealings of the Lord. They were also wroth with him upon the waters because they hardened their hearts against the Lord. Now that's quite a callback from 400 years later in the history. For an author writing in a straight line and not going back and rereading, that's quite an accomplishment. And yet everything they said is consistent, although with a different viewpoint, from the original account we have of Nephi crossing the ocean. So anyway, back to Zenoff. Zenoph's adventures led him to being appointed king of the people of Lehi Nephi, and upon his death we get his son who became the wicked king Noah, which led to the story of Abinadi, which gives us Alma, and we thank him for that. Well, anyway, about 50 or 60 years later, we hear from King Mosiah, son of the first Mosiah, and Mosiah 25 says, "And now all the people of Nephi were assembled together, and also the people of Zarahemla, and they were gathered together in two bodies. And it came to pass that Mosiah did read, and caused to be read, the records of Zenoff, from the time they left the land of Zarahemla until they returned again." So good. Now we're going to get more details of these two journeys that Amaleki very first mentioned back at the end of the Book of Mormon. An even more amazing callback account is of the 24 gold plates that were found by the people of King Limhi as they searched for the land of Zarahemla. Limhi had become king of the people of Lehi Nephi after Zenoff. That account runs through all of Mosiah and is mentioned even more in Alma, but doesn't really get told fully until we get to the Book of Ether, way at the end of the Book of Mormon. So let me go through this one quickly. Limhi is the first to mention the 24 gold plates. In Mosiah 8, it tells us, "Now as soon as Ammon had read the record, the king inquired of him to know if he could interpret languages. And Ammon told him that he could not. And the king said unto him, Being grieved for the afflictions of my people, I caused that 43 of my people should take the journey into the wilderness, that thereby they might find the land of Zarahemla." This is just kind of a reverse of the journey that Amaleki mentioned in Omni. "And we might appeal unto our brethren to deliver us out of bondage. And they were lost in the wilderness for the space of many days. Yet they were diligent, and found not the land of Zarahemla, but returned to this land, having traveled in a land of many waters, having discovered a land which was covered with the bones of men and of beasts, and was also covered with ruins of buildings of every kind, having discovered a land which had been peopled with a people who were numerous as the hosts of Israel. And for a testimony that the things that they had said were true, they have brought 24 gold plates, which are filled with engravings, and they are of pure gold." Now this is all we learn about those plates at this time, and we have to wait 13 more chapters to learn anything about them. In Mosiah 21 we hear this: "Now King Limhi had sent, previous to the coming of Ammon, a small number of men to search for the land of Zarahemla, but they could not find it, and they were lost in the wilderness. Nevertheless, they did find a land which had been peopled and which had been destroyed, and they, having supposed it to be the land of Zarahemla, returned to the land of Nephi, having arrived in the borders of the land not many days before the coming of Ammon. And they brought a record with them, even a record of the people whose bones they had found. And it was engraven upon plates of ore. Two very interesting things here. One is that this is the first time we learn that the men sent out thought that the land they found was in fact Zarahemla, but that it had been destroyed. And of course they were wrong about that. And two, as it is Mormon relating this account here in his abridgment, he says simply that the plates were made of ore, but does not say that they were pure gold. And still, we don't know what's on those plates. So the next time we hear about those plates is 7 chapters later in Mosiah 28. There, Limhi and his people have freed themselves from the Lamanites and have come to Zarahemla and have been told by Ammon that Mosiah could translate the plates. And this is one of the first things that Limhi asks Mosiah. He gives Mosiah the plates, and we read about Mosiah. It says, "Therefore he took the records which were engraven on the plates of brass, and also the plates of Nephi, and all the things he kept and preserved according to the commandments of God, after having translated and caused to be written the records which were on the plates of gold, which had been found by the people of Limhi, which were delivered to him by the hand of Limhi. And this he did because of the great anxiety of the people, for they were desirous beyond measure to know concerning those people who had been destroyed." So here we know that the plates were in fact translated, and we know that Mosiah's people heard what was on them. But we still don't know, and we have to wait another 47 years in the record to hear any more. Finally, in Alma 37, the plates are mentioned again. We find Alma talking to his son Helaman, and he says, "And now I will speak unto you concerning those 24 gold plates, that ye keep them, that the mysteries and the works of darkness and their secret works, or the secret works of those people who have been destroyed, may be manifest unto this people. Yea, all their murders and robbings and their plunderings and all their wickedness and abominations may be made manifest unto this people." But we still don't get to hear what's on them, and we won't for the rest of Mormon's abridgment. It's not until Moroni decides to add the Book of Ether to his father's record that we hear the actual story that was on those plates. This is the part of the record that Mosiah had translated 500 years earlier. It's kind of remarkable that this thread of these 24 gold plates made its way through 500 years of the record and kept showing up periodically. For an author writing in a straight line without going back, this would have been quite an accomplishment. And for an author who inserted such a tantalizing story as the discovery of 24 pure gold plates, you would think that had he been making this story up, he would have told us all about those plates at the time. But no, it trickles along for 500 more years. And thank heavens for the Book of Ether. I just love that book. I present this just as an example of the continuity of the whole record from the beginning to the end by a man who never kept notes, never went back to read or edit anything from the first time it was put on paper. That was a truly remarkable accomplishment. And anyone who actually takes the time to read the Book of Mormon and reads it carefully, taking the time to consider all it says, would have to agree at the very least that it is an extraordinary book. It has been called by some of the very most influential scholars of American literature as one of the most influential books of said literature. The Library of Congress of the United States included the Book of Mormon in its Books That Shaped America list. An online vote associated with that list determined that it was the 4th most influential book in American literature. Daniel Walker Howe, a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, stated that the Book of Mormon should rank among the great achievements of American literature. Non-Mormon scholar Stephen Prothero called it America's most influential homegrown scripture, noting its impact beyond purely religious context. All of this and much more from a man of whom his wife later said, "Joseph Smith could neither write nor dictate a coherent and well-worded letter, let alone dictating a book like the Book of Mormon. And though I was an active participant in the scenes that transpired, and was present during the translation of the plates, and had cognizance of things as they transpired, it is marvelous to me, a marvel and a wonder, as much so as to anyone else." That statement was given in 1879, fully 35 years after his martyrdom in 1844. She followed that statement up with her testimony of the Book of Mormon. She said, "My belief is that the Book of Mormon is of divine authenticity. I have not the slightest doubt of it. I am satisfied that no man could have dictated the writings of the manuscripts unless he was inspired. For when acting as his scribe, he would dictate to me hour after hour, and when returning after meals or other interruptions, he would at once begin where he left off, without seeing the manuscript or having any portion of it read to him. This was a usual thing to do. It would have been improbable that a learned man could do this, and for one so ignorant and unlearned as he was, it was simply impossible." Powerful words, I think. Now, before I leave you today, I want to share one more amazing evidence of Joseph Smith's foresight and prophetic ability. This again is knowledge shared with the world well before it was discovered many years later. It's not from the Book of Mormon. It comes from the pearl of great price, the Book of Abraham. This was the translation of some ancient scrolls that accompanied several mummies that toured the U.S. for a time back in the 1830s. The scrolls were purchased by members of the church from one Michael Chandler and given to Joseph in 1835, and he translated them in 1842. I did a whole podcast on this. It's episode 37, and it's titled Napoleon, Einstein, and the Book of Abraham. And I'll just share a little highlight from that podcast here. Chapter 3 is, I think, where the book really stands apart from the rest of Scripture. It's all about Abraham's effort to teach in the Egyptian court principles of astronomy not understood by most civilizations until thousands of years later. It begins with Abraham consulting the Urim and Thummim. "And I, Abraham, had the Urim and Thummim, which the Lord my God had given unto me in the Ur of the Chaldees. And I saw stars, that they were very great, and that one of them was nearest unto the throne of God. And there were many great ones which were near unto it. And the Lord said unto me, These are the governing ones, and the name of the great one is Kolob, because it is near unto me. For I am the Lord thy God. I have set this one to govern all those which belong to the same order as that upon which thou standest." The concept of governing stars was a very advanced idea in its own right back in Abraham's day and for a couple of thousand years thereafter. You must remember that for most of the last 1700 years, since the Council of Nicaea, the worldview was of a geocentric universe. That's one in which the Earth is the center of the universe and around which everything else revolves. Here, though, we clearly see that Abraham, or rather the Lord, is saying that there are much greater stars than our little planet. He says, "I have set this one to govern all those which belong to the same order as that upon which thou standest," indicating that the earth is in the grasp of a much bigger celestial body. You may ask, is this great governing star the sun? Well, I don't think so, but the sun is a perfect example of a much greater star governing or holding us within its gravitational grasp. We orbit the sun because of its strong gravitational field. But if you extend outward a bit, you find that our solar system, that is, the sun and all the planets that rotate around it, are only part of a much bigger structure that forms just one small part of a giant arm that forms one small part of our Milky Way galaxy. Everything in our galaxy rotates, ultimately around something much more massive, and massive doesn't really do it justice, an incredibly large structure at the center of it. The size of the structure at the center of the Milky Way galaxy is so large that the sun and our solar system are only the merest, virtually invisible speck. Astrophysicists tell us that our galaxy, with a diameter of over 100,000 light years, is part of an even bigger structure, including many, many galaxies, and so on and so on. You get the idea. Space is very, very big, and in one way or another, everything is rotating around something still bigger than itself. Now, this may not be so earth-shaking to you, my dear listeners, but in early mankind, this was mind-blowing. But there's so much more, and this is the part that really impresses me. Verse 4 says, "And the Lord said unto me by the Urim and Thummim that Kolob was after the manner of the Lord according to its times and seasons in the rotations thereof, and that one rotation was a day unto the Lord after his manner of reckoning, it being 1,000 years according unto that whereon thou standest. This is the reckoning of the Lord's time according to the reckoning of Kolob." Now, this verse says a number of very amazing things. First of all, it says that one day to God is 1,000 years to us. That means if we once lived with God in his domain, then we also would have lived according to that manner of reckoning of time. And if that's so, then this mere mortal existence we live here on earth, let's say 80 years average, is really only just slightly than 2 hours in celestial time. Put another way, we lived with Mother and Father in the heavens according to their time and agreed to come down here for just under 2 hours for a test. A final exam, I guess. It's not so different from taking final exams in college. This earthly existence is just a very short interlude as we move forward towards our eternal destiny. If we are only here for 2 hours, then why does it feel like 80 years to us? This is the part that excites me. The scripture implies that the perception of time is relative to the size and speed of rotation of the planet upon which you stand. In other words, the book of Abraham is telling us that time is relative. Now, I wonder who else said that. In 1905, a young second-class patent clerk in the Swiss Patent Office wrote and published 4 papers that literally changed the world. And that year has been called the Annus Mirabilis, in Latin, the miraculous year, ever since. He wrote one paper on the microscopic movement of particles in a fluid, referred to as Brownian motion, which proved the existence of atoms. Another paper was the photovoltaic effect, which proved that light came in discrete particles, or packets called photons, rather than in waves, and that led to a Nobel Prize. He wrote a third paper on the energy-mass equivalency, showing that mass and energy were just different forms of the same stuff. That's the paper which gave us the equation almost everybody in the world can repeat, E equals mc squared. That equation ushered in the nuclear age and the promise one day of unlimited power. It also opened the door to nuclear weapons. The fourth paper came to be known as the theory of special relativity. It is, as were all his papers, a remarkable paper that said, basically, that the speed of light is constant throughout the universe and to all reckoning. But what it means is that our perception of time is relative to our speed and movement through that universe. It's a very weird concept, I know, but it says that if I stand firmly on the ground and you get in a very fast spaceship and go very close to the speed of light, and you sit down to eat dinner and take 1 hour to do so, that during that same time you eat dinner, many years would have passed here on Earth, and you would return to a world completely new to you. I know, this is weird stuff, right? The man who wrote those papers was named Albert Einstein, and he has been called the greatest thinker of the 20th century and one of the most brilliant men in history. But if you think about it, this relativity of time is exactly what Abraham 3 verse 4 is saying. In other words, the Book of Abraham, published in 1842, revealed the elements of the theory of special relativity 63 years before Albert Einstein did. And if you think Joseph Smith concocted the Book of Abraham, then you have to say that Joseph Smith came up with the theory of special relativity 63 years before Einstein did. How can that be? It can only be because he was a prophet. And the truth is the truth, no matter when or where it is uncovered. Einstein didn't invent relativity, neither did Joseph Smith. But the physics are true and eternal, and if the Lord wished to reveal it to Joseph Smith before he did to Albert Einstein, then so be it. Joseph's life and work was one of almost constant revelation, and the things he put forth may have sounded strange in his day. That was the burden he had to bear, but the test of time would ultimately prove him right on so many things, and so many more things that are waiting to be discovered by the intellectuals and the learned people of the world. But they will be, and we will see that Joseph was right all along, and then he will be revered by all, because you see, timing is everything. I'm Mark Swint. Thank you for listening.